Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. And thank you all for being here. This is the 6th presentation we've given on Budget 101. And so hopefully we have perfected our presentation here. We'll see. Today will consist of about a 35-minute presentation on the budget, which we'll talk about where we've been and where we're going. And then we'll have about an hour for Q&A. So I'd like to introduce Michelle Quinn, who's our CFO, to start us off.
Good morning. And actually, I kind of tend to wander. Is there, like if I cross in front of you? Okay, just checking.
We're going to have a shadow today.
Okay, that's good. This is the first time that this has been filmed, and so I asked, I said, well, do I need to wear anything particular? They said, just make sure you don't wear the old logo. So I want you to notice I've got the new logo here. I've been here long enough, 20 years, that I remember when the old logo was the new logo. So it's good to have everybody here. I appreciate you being here. And we'll talk about where we are with the budget. So this builds on some of the conversations that we had last spring when we started talking about the challenges that we were facing. But I think there's also some new information. We'll touch a little bit on discounting, which was one of the primary themes of what we were really trying to discuss last year, but move on to some other things as well. So the first thing is we really want to make sure it's clear, what do we mean by structural deficit? So Andy's been talking about a structural deficit, $10 million. What is that? How did we get there? And then, of course, how do we fix it? That's the most important thing. So structural deficit, what that means is that as a university, the way that we are currently configured in terms of the academic programs that we offer, the student support services that we offer, the kinds of technology we have, our facilities, everything that we have in place to operate costs us $10 million a year more than we are bringing in. So one of the things we've been focusing on over the last several years is what's happening with our cash balances. And that's a way to sort of gauge what your deficit is. As your cash balances are going down, that's showing you that every year you have a deficit. However, in any given year, you may not have an actual deficit of $10 million because your structural deficit is $10 million, but you can do some things to sort of reduce your expenses or hold them down for a year. One of the most obvious is that in this year, 2018, we did not give any salary increases to faculty or exempt staff. So that was something that we did to sort of hold down our costs. Another thing that we have done over the years is we have deferred our investments in capital. So the university has about an $800 million facility, and the sort of a normal rate of capital investment would be $8 or $9 million a year. But in any given year, you can say, well, we won't do that much. And that's sort of kinds of the decisions that you make about a home or a car. You've got a regular schedule for oil changes, you've got a regular schedule for getting your tires replaced, but you can defer some of those things, but you can't defer them indefinitely. It is a way, however, to save cash in the short term. In the long term, we have to eliminate the structural deficit, which means we have to make permanent changes. So how did we get here? In essence, we had an unfulfilled growth strategy. And I like to quote Christine Scanlon, who is one of our Board of Trustees members. And when we talked with the board about where we were financially last spring, one of the things that she said that was quoted in the Greeley Tribune is that we bet on growth, which isn't a bad strategy, until it doesn't happen. And I think that sort of summarizes where we are as an institution. So let's talk a little bit about why we bet on growth. First of all, as we went into 2010, 2011, we were building up our cash reserves. And at that point in time, we had come out of the national economic crisis of 2008. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change in the higher education environment. And so we were building up our cash. Then, starting in about 2014, we adopted a growth strategy because we knew that the environment was permanently changed and we needed to do something differently as an institution. And we said, we're going to grow. And many of you will remember that we talked about growing to a campus of 15,000 students. Ultimately, as we all know, those targets proved to be unrealistic. So we were making investments in growing enrollment. We did things with marketing, with enrollment coaches, with student success. We made some targeted investments in academic programs. But ultimately, we were spending down reserves because we were spending more than we were bringing in every year. So every year, our cash balances or our reserves were going down. Now, what was it that really, what were the environmental factors that caused us to make this decision? Well, first of all, reduced state funding. And this chart shows state funding from fiscal year 10 through fiscal year 19. And as you can see, generally, it's very flat here. But what I want to highlight is what was happening here in fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 11, the first two on the left. So after the 2008 economic crisis, states were very limited in their funding. Their tax revenues had gone down as people's capital gains went down, and so they didn't have the money to provide support to all of the state services, including higher education. The federal government stepped in with what is referred to as state fiscal stabilization funds. So a pretty self-explanatory title. The federal government said the states are really struggling, so we're going to give all of the states some subsidy to help them stabilize their fiscal situation. And you can see what that meant to us. So in fiscal year 10, we received $44.1 million from the state. But if you see how that column is broken up there, only 20 million of it really came from the state. The other 24 million came to us through the state, but really from the federal government. So in fiscal year 10, if we had not had, as a state, that federal stabilization money, University of Northern Colorado would have only received $20 million. So we had a real sort of fundamental economic problem as a state, which then flowed through to the institutions of higher education. And for a while, it was sort of masked or deferred by the fact that we were getting that federal money. However, once that federal money went away, the state couldn't continue to support. So what you see is in fiscal year 10, we were at 44.1 million. In fiscal year 12, we had dropped to 32.8. So a quarter of our state funding went away, $11 million in 2 years. And so this is where we were really starting to see kind of the new normal of higher education funding. And what you can see is that remained fairly constant here, fiscal year 13, 14, 15. We bumped up a little bit, dropped down a little bit here. In fiscal year 19, we've got $42.5 million in state funding, which in nominal dollars is less than we were getting back here in fiscal year 10. So for all intents and purposes, our state funding has remained flat. The other thing that was happening environmentally in terms of higher education is a decreasing number of high school graduates. And so what you see on this map here is some projections for the number of college-going students or high school graduates that intend to go to college from 2012 to 2029. This is a relatively recent chart that's been put together by Nathan Graw from Carleton College. He published a book on higher education and demographics early in 2018. But this was information that these projections were very similar back in 2008, 2009, 2010. We could see that the number of high school graduates were flattening. Now, what you see immediately on this chart is there's a lot of red. So the red is states where the number of high school graduates or college-going students are forecasted to decrease. And where there isn't red, there's orange and yellow, again, forecasted decreases in the number of college-going students. There is some good news on the chart, and that's the blue. So Colorado and the rest of the Mountain West actually is in the fortunate position that we expect high school graduates and college-going students to increase over the next 15, 20 years. The problem for us, and this was the problem that we were well aware of and sort of facing back in 2009, 2010, is that everybody over in these red states here, the Northeast, the Midwest, all of these folks know that we're blue, and so all of the institutions in those states have been coming to Colorado and to the Mountain West to attract our students. Sean Broghammer, our director of admissions, has a nice graph that shows that we've got like something like 25 to 30 different out-of-state institutions who actually have a physical presence in Denver to recruit Colorado students. So this is what we were facing: permanently reduced state funding and increased competition nationwide for high school students. And this is why we adopted a growth strategy. So here's how it all comes together, and this is sort of the most dense or busiest chart that I have, and we'll spend a little bit of time on it, and then things move a little bit more quickly after that. So if you look at this, this shows cash balances. Over to the left, this is 2010. At June 30th of 2010, we had $58 million. That grew to $80 million. And then here we are at June 30th, 2018, and we have $40 million. So from June 30th, 2013 to June 30th of 2018, we used up half of our reserves that we have. So we still have $40 million, but we have used up half in the last 6 years. You look at the left-hand side here and you say, oh, but things were going pretty well here in 2010, 11, and 12. Well, yes, in terms of our cash balances, they were actually going up, but we need to remember why those cash balances were going up. So first, we talked a little bit about the federal backfill. So we were getting federal money that was not sustainable. It was sort of propping up our state funding, but that wasn't going to continue forever. The other thing that we did is on the revenue side, we were increasing our prices. This top line here, the 9/20, 9/15, this shows the undergraduate and graduate rate increases. So from 2010 through 2013 here, we had 4 years of double-digit graduate price increases. 2010, it was an average of 20%, but some of the programs here on campus, we actually increased at 40 or 50%. So we were adjusting our prices and we were increasing our revenue through price adjustments, which really is charging our students more money. We also, on the undergraduate side, had several years here of well above cost of living increases in undergraduate tuition, 9%, 9%, 13%. Also on our room and board, not quite as high as the undergraduate and graduate tuition, but still above the rate of inflation or the consumer price index. This is all familiar. These are the things that are of great concern nationally as prices continue to go up. We all know, both from reading the national news and from the experience that we have with students on a daily basis, that these price increases are difficult for them and their families. But this is what we were doing to sort of try to rebalance where we are, bring up our cash balances. The other thing we were doing on the expense side is we were holding down the amount of money that we were investing in institutional capital. So 5.5 million, 3.8, 5.3. And remember, I said that sort of a normal rate of increase for an institution our size, or excuse me, not rate of increase, I apologize, rate of annual investment in capital would be $8 or $9 million. So we were well below that in these years. And in addition, we had 3 years of no salary increases for faculty and exempt staff. Classified staff also experienced a couple of years of no salary increases. Their salaries are driven by the decisions at the state level. These were decisions that we made as an institution. Then also in 2011 and 2012, we had a staff hiring freeze, so we were holding down the number of people on campus. So it was these sorts of temporary things: federal backfill, increasing our prices at a pretty significant rate here, holding down on capital investments, holding flat on salaries, holding flat on hiring, that allowed us to build up our cash reserves here. But that fundamental structural problem was really there. We were already seeing the effects of permanently reduced state funding and increased competition. So once we built up those cash balances and then we started to normalize our expenses, still tuition here was going up at above the rate of inflation. Room and board, we were holding a little bit more flat. On the capital side, we started to spend an appropriate amount per year, $8 or $9 million. We reinvested a little bit to try to catch up in faculty and staff salaries at 5%, 3%, 2%. As we started to sort of normalize our expenditures and to fully fund what we were doing as an institution, that's when you see that our cash balances start to go down and we actually start to see that underlying structural deficit. So for pretty much all of this time here, we're going down roughly $10 million a year. You do notice over here in 2016, there's kind of a weird situation where you go from 61 million to 46 million. This was a timing issue. Normally, we would get a state payment in June. In 2016, that didn't come in June. It didn't come until July, so you sort of had this temporary timing difference. We had another payment that was delayed that year as well. And again, it was just a matter of June versus July, but because we end our fiscal year at June 30th, it makes this drop look pretty significant. But then we caught it up this next year because we got it, the payment came through in July here. The other thing that happened in 2017 is we sold university apartments, and so we had a one-time cash inflow of $6 million. Bottom line, however, is that really about $10 million a year is how much our balances were going down. So our balances are going down. We said we are investing in enrollment. What was happening on the enrollment side? This chart shows new student headcount, both undergraduate and graduate. Each year has two bars. The dark bar with the blue and the gold shows actual headcount, and then the lighter color bar shows what the target was for that year. So obviously what you can see is that in every year, our actual enrollment was below our target. Now, that's sort of the crux of the problem here, is that we were under our targets. We had bet on growth, which isn't a bad strategy until it doesn't happen, and this is where it wasn't happening. We did grow, however, and we don't want to miss that fact. So if you look at graduate, we were at 774 new graduate students. We went down to 684. But then here in 1 year, from fall of 14 to fall of 15, we grew 22% in the number of new graduate students that we had. So that was a pretty significant achievement, a lot of hard work by the graduate school, by faculty, looking at new programs, trying to think about programs that were sort of market ready for students, particularly graduate students who might not be attending full time, might be continuing to work. So what is sometimes referred to as kind of professional graduate programs. So some really excellent work was done here, up 22%. Then the following year, we were up another 12% in new graduate students, and then up another 6%. So some good growth on graduate, but again, not at the levels that had been targeted or planned. On the undergraduate side, we were around 2,800 here for several years. We grew about 6% here in fall of 16, but then leveled off, and then this fall, actually, we are down a little bit in the number of our new undergraduate students. The other thing I want to talk about is not just new students, but also retention. So when we talk about our undergraduate students, the other thing that's really important is how many of them are we helping to actually succeed and graduate. So this shows the history of our fall to fall retention of first-time undergraduates. Historically, we've been around 68, 69, 70%. If this chart went further back to the left, you'd see that that's pretty constant for a very long period of time. However, In 2011, 2012, our fall-to-fall retention rate actually dropped to around 66%. So that means that for every 100 new undergraduate students we were bringing in, 34 of them left from the fall they started to what would have been the fall of their sophomore year. Some good news here is that that started to creep back up as we were making investments in student success, making sure that we were doing things to help retain those students. And you can see here that and this is an unofficial rate, fall 18 isn't finalized yet, but it looks like we'll actually be above 72% this year. So some nice gradual growth, and certainly as Andy has been talking on campus, this is something that we absolutely need to continue to improve. So what does that all mean when you put it together in terms of what our total student FTE looked like? And when we talk about FTE, that's full-time equivalent. So for an undergraduate student, if they take 30 credit hours over the course of a year, that is one full-time equivalent. Now, if you've got a student that maybe takes only 15 credit hours over the course of the year, that's considered half an FTE. So that's what we mean by full-time equivalent, is it's sort of weighting students based upon the number of credit hours they take, not just the head count on campus. On the graduate side, one FTE is equivalent to 24 credit hours because the full-time load for a graduate student is less than the full-time load for an undergraduate student. What you can see here is on the graduate side, we actually grew over 25% in FTE. We were at 1767 in fiscal year 10, and here we're up to 2267 in fiscal year 18. However, on the undergraduate side, we'd historically been around 9,500 FTE. We've dropped down, we dropped down, we dropped down. We started to regain a little bit here in fiscal year 17, but certainly not to the level that we had been historically. So this is where we are on the revenue side of the institution's financial picture. What drives our revenue is primarily student FTE. And from fiscal year 10 to fiscal year 18, it decreased from 11,179 to 10,942. So we were losing in student FTE, revenue side. So then let's turn to the expense side. Whoops. Actually, I got ahead of myself a little bit. I apologize. On the undergraduate net revenue, this kind of pulls this together a little bit. And this gets into the discounting. So with undergraduate net revenue, this shows how the total revenue, gross revenue, was growing. And when I say gross revenue, what I mean by that is what we are billing to students in terms of tuition and fees. But what is happening more and more in public higher education is that what you bill students is not what you actually require them to pay. And so what we're doing, and not just UNC, but nationally, this is true of higher education, public higher education, is we may bill a student $10,000, but then we turn around and we give them $4,000 in institutionally funded scholarships. And when we say institutionally funded scholarships, that means basically we're just giving them a discount. So we've given them a 40% discount on their bill, charged them $10,000 and said, oh, you only need to pay $6,000 of that. Whoop. So our discounting as an institution, if you start over here in fiscal year 10, you can see that we're just a little bit, maybe around $15 million, and we're kind of gradually creeping up. Then what happens is in fiscal year 15, from here to fiscal year 18, we grew from around $15 million to about $30 million. So in a fairly short time frame, we doubled the amount of institutionally funded scholarships or discounting that we were providing to students. So what that means is that although our billings, our gross revenue, were going up, when you look at our net revenue, what students were actually paying, it's tracking upwards here, then it kind of levels off and dips down a little bit here, and then it actually dipped down again in fall of 17. So in fall of 17, we had more undergraduate students than we had the year before. We had increased our tuition by 6.8%, but we actually had reduced the amount of net revenue that we were bringing in by $1.5 million. And this is why last spring we started to have conversations about where we are, because this was a very significant problem for us in terms of reducing our revenue but serving more students. One of the things that we did is we changed our discounting strategy for fall 18, and what you can see here is that we are projecting that our revenue this year for undergraduate students, even though we actually have fewer this year, our total revenue will go up because we've reduced and kind of modified the amount of discounting that we are doing for undergraduate students. Last thing I want to point out on this slide is that total net revenue from undergraduate students is about $70 million. This is a significant portion of our budget, and we need to continue to focus on our undergraduate enrollment because it makes up such a large part of our budget. On the other side, we've got graduate net revenue, and this tracks a little bit better than the undergraduate. These are the gross tuition and fees for graduate students going up both because of the price increases and because of the growth in graduate FTE. You can see the bottom red line here, a little bit more moderated growth in terms of the amount of discounting that we're doing. And so because the discounting was more moderate, then the net revenue actually has been increasing at a fairly consistent rate along with the gross revenue. So a better picture on the graduate side, but in terms of the percent of our overall budget, graduate net revenue is only $28 million as compared to undergraduate net revenue, which is $70. That 28 is very important. Our graduate population is very important to us as an institution. But in terms of revenue, it is not as significant as the undergraduate side. So now let me turn to expenses. It does not want to go to expenses today. Can you put that forward for me, Brian? I'm not sure what happened. So I talked about student FTE as being our revenue driver, and we talked about the fact that overall, from fiscal year 13, it's gone down 5%. At the same time, what drives our expenses or our cost is in large part our staffing, and that has gone up. So our staff FTE over that same time period has gone up 10%, and our faculty FTE has gone up 9%. So that's a very significant and important part of our budget. That's been going up. The student FTE has been going down, and so that imbalance that we already sort of were starting to have back in 2008, 2009, 2010 has been exacerbated by the differences in the growth of what drives our cost in terms of staff and faculty FTE, and the reduction in what drives our revenue, which is student FTE. Brian, you're going to have to push ahead for me. Okay, so this is salaries, fringes, and operating expenses. I just mentioned that staffing makes up the largest portion of our budget, about 70%. So this chart shows you from fiscal year 13 through fiscal year 18 how those things have changed. So if you look at salaries, we've gone from $90 million to $109.2 million. That's a 21% growth over that time period. That includes the effect of both increases in salary as well as the growth in staffing. The yellow shows fringe benefits. That's gone from $22.8 million to $30.7 million, or a growth over that time period of 35%. So fringe benefits on our payroll has been another thing that has been a significant cost increase. What's driving that is increases in the cost of health insurance, as well as increases in the amount that we have to contribute towards PARA, our defined benefit contribution plan. So that's the state level plan, and the rate of contribution that we have to make. Back in fiscal year 13, we were doing about 13% of salaries. The state has increased that to 20% of salaries. And so that's been another piece that's driven the increase in fringe benefits. The last thing that you'll see there is the operating costs, or the non-personnel expenses. And that's grown at a much more moderate rate of about 12%. So from $42.6 million to $47.5 million. Click. Okay, so salaries. Want to dig into salaries a little bit here. The first top line, the dark blue line, shows staff salaries. This includes both classified and exempt salaries. It does not include administrator salaries. One of the questions that has been consistently asked is, well, what about administrators? And by that, people mean the most highly paid individuals at the institution. So we haven't historically separated that out, but what we did is we used the CUPA definition of an administrator. And CUPA is a professional organization that higher education human resources folks use, and it's a place where we submit data. So we use their definition to come up with a trend on administrator salaries, and that's the bottom lower light blue line there. And what we mean by administrator, there's about 65 people on campus, and essentially what it includes is the president, the vice presidents, the assistant vice presidents, the deans, and the AVPs. So we're kind of pulling that out so that everyone can see exactly how we differentiate administrators from other staff. Then, of course, there are the instructional faculty, and that includes, on the orange line, tenure track, and contract renewable faculty. So you can see the growth there. And then the yellow line with the X's on it shows adjunct, faculty overloads, summer, interim, PSAs, and then also TA and GA salary. So instructional salary costs that are not, that are for teaching classes but are different from the tenure track, or contract renewable. Fringe benefits. I mentioned that these had increased 35% from fiscal year 13 to fiscal year 18. You can see that it's the retirement in the blue line and the medical, dental, life, and disability in the orange line, which both make up the largest part of our fringe benefits, about 80% combined, and which have the steepest rate of increase from fiscal year 13 to fiscal year 18. Down in the lower part of the graph, you can see other kinds of fringe benefit costs, workers' comp, unemployment, the employee assistance program, those kinds of things. Now let's turn to the non-personnel side. This is not all of our non-personnel expenses, but just a few things that we're trying to pull out to highlight what's been changing in terms of our non-personnel expenses. First thing I'm going to point out is supplies at the top there. It's the green line with the triangle markers, and it's kind of gone up and down. This includes all supplies across the university, and a lot of times folks are thinking, well, you know, I'm thinking about my office supplies, they're not that much, what are we spending all this money on? This includes every part of the university. It includes athletics, it includes dining, it includes housing. So this includes not only things that you would think of as office supplies, but it also includes athletic training supplies, it includes supplies for the dining halls, it includes cleaning supplies, it includes supplies from the maintenance and trades organizations and everything. So that's supplies. A second thing that I want to point out is the orange line at the bottom, which is software maintenance. Another area where we have seen continually increasing costs is in our software maintenance costs. And what we mean by software maintenance is once we have some kind of software, you're paying some sort of annual fee to continue to use that software. Used to be that, probably 15, 20 years ago, when you bought a piece of software, you sort of paid for it and then you just had it and it was. Well, that's not the way that it works anymore. The way that it works now is you're constantly getting upgrades, and so you're basically paying an annual fee for your software, whether it's resident on your hard drive or whether it's something in the cloud, you're still paying annually for that software. So, as is the case sort of with all kinds of organizations, we are putting more and more emphasis on automation and digitization and digital strategies. And so the amount of software that we have, the number of things that are automated on campus continue to go up. Many of you should be familiar that in the fall we have sort of a request process to capture all of the potential IT projects that different areas may be interested in. Well, what happens is once you have an IT project, let's say you implement, A few years ago, we implemented a piece of software called Slate, which we're using to communicate and recruit students and sort of maintain really good ongoing communications with them from the time that they apply to the time that they actually enroll at the university. So you sort of have an implementation cost, and that's part of that IT project request process that we have. But once you've done that, then you have ongoing costs to continue to maintain that software and to have the upgrades. So that's another price pressure that's been on us. The last thing that I'll highlight on this chart is utilities, which is the yellow line with the kind of X's in it. We actually have had some good news in our utility costs that they have gone down over this period of time. Now, a large part of that is because of really good work that we've done to sort of contain our energy consumption. There's the Student Leaf Organization, which has done some wonderful projects, particularly things like holding down our external water usage by making investments in our sprinkler system so that we're using less water. We've also done some things where we've kept the water usage inside down by changing fixtures in the bathrooms and in the kitchens and so on to reduce the water usage. And one of the most significant things is changes in lighting. And so the technology for lighting has been changing pretty rapidly over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. And so with new lighting technology, we can actually reduce the amount of energy we're using. So good news there. But it's also important to be aware that another reason why those costs have been held down and actually decreased is the price of natural gas. And natural gas prices have been very favorable to us over the last several years, and favorable to everybody, it's not just us. But, and there are some indications that natural gas prices will start going up. So if natural gas prices go up, that will affect our utility costs. About 80% of our utility budget is really driven by natural gas prices, and that includes both heating, what you would normally think of, but it also includes our electricity as well. The other 25% of our budget for utilities is sewer, water, and trash. That would not be affected by natural gas prices, but we could see some increasing pressures there. So how does this all come together? We started out in fiscal year 13. We kind of had this structural deficit. Our revenue here is below our expenses. And when you look at the trend of the yellow line going up, 2.6% on an annualized basis, not a terrible rate of growth in our expenses. Consumer price index or inflation over that time would have been 2.5%. But the crux of the matter is that our net revenue only grew by an annualized rate of 2.1%. We needed that to grow faster than the rate of expenditures. And not only did it not grow faster, but it actually was slightly below. So we still have a structural deficit here as we are in fiscal year 19, about halfway through that. So this is where we are as a campus. What do we need to do? This goes back to our cash balances picture, shows that same fiscal year 10, we were at $58 million, shows how we went up as we were doing temporary things to hold down our expenses and build up our cash balances. And then you can see the fairly consistent decline from fiscal year 14 through fiscal year 18, where we ended at $40.5 million. What you also see is 2 years of sort of trend information. And when I say trend information, that means if we did nothing. So we ended up June 30th, 2018 with $40 million. If we just kind of let our structural deficit play out and we did nothing, we'd go down to $30 million at June 30th, 2019, and we'd go down to $20 million at June 30th, 2020. Now that's not what we're doing. As you know, we've done some things this year to kind of keep our expenses down. So at June 30th, 2019, I think we'll be at more like $34 million rather than $30 million. So we're doing some things to maintain our cash balances. But the other piece that I want to point out is that if you look at June 2020 being at $20 million, right below that there's a red line. Well, what does that red line mean? That means that every single year at June 30th, we've got a balance in our bank that's sort of our fiscal year end, our financial statement balance of cash, because that's when we have to officially report. But from June 30th to August 15th, we still have to pay payroll, we still have to pay utilities, we still have to pay water, and that is also the time of year when we do our capital projects. So much of our capital cash is being expended at that time. So from June 30th to August 15th, we typically go down in our cash balance by about $15 or $20 million. So if you just use that trend number, which isn't what we're going to do, but if you start at the $20 million at June 30th of 2020, what you can see is that by August 15th of 2020, we'd only have $5 million in the bank. $5 million, what does that mean to us as an institution, as individuals? $5 million sounds like a lot of money in the bank, but as an institution, $5 million would only be about half of what we need to fund our monthly payroll. So clearly, that's an unacceptably low cash balance at that point, and that's why we really need to act now and make some changes in what we're doing as an institution. So how do we fix it? Turning back to state funding, talked a lot about the fact that state funding prospects are fairly limited. We're always very thankful when the state is able to increase our funding. Right now, the outgoing governor's proposed budget for next year has an overall increase for higher education funding of 10%. So depending upon how the formula actually plays out, for UNC, that would mean maybe $3.5 million, something like that. So some good news, at least in the short term on the state side, but we should not count on it. The pressures that remain on the state's budget in terms of the number of things that they have to fund, we shouldn't be expecting that there will be overall growth in the state higher education budget of any significant amount. The other question that people ask is, well, are we then getting our share of that overall higher education budget? What this shows is the state funding that we get per resident student FTE. And if you see where UNC is, we're getting $52.97 per resident FTE, which is better than CU, better than Mesa, and better than Metro. And in fact, this chart comes from Metro because this is a chart that Metro likes to show because they're the ones that are getting the lowest amount of state funding per FTE in Colorado. You look to the left of us and you say, well, there's some folks that are getting more. Well, here's what you need to understand is that Adams, Fort Lewis, Western, and even Mines are significantly smaller than we are. So because of economies of scale, it is quite normal and quite expected that smaller institutions are going to be getting a lower amount per FTE than mid-size and larger institutions. Adams, Fort Lewis, and Western are getting about $12, $11 million each. On a per FTE basis, it's higher, but UNC is still getting that $42 million. So because of our economies of scale, it makes sense that our per FTE amount would be somewhat lower. Mines is also smaller than us, and they have high-cost programs, and so their per FTE amount is higher than ours is. CSU, you need to be aware that there's kind of two pieces to it. The top piece is what they are getting that is dedicated funding for vet med. But if you take that out, their basic funding per FTE, you may hear it referred to as COF, College Opportunity Fund, and fee for service, is less than ours. So we're well positioned. We're getting our fair share of the state money, such as it is, but we should not be counting on that for significant growth. What about our other revenue opportunities? Again, remember that our undergraduate net tuition is $70 million, so a very significant portion of our budget. Graduate net tuition at $28 million, and then you can see the other sources of funding as well. And as I mentioned before, this is total university revenue. So when I was showing you the expenses and I was saying this is supplies for the entire university, includes dining supplies and athletic supplies, this is total university revenue. So you can see the housing and dining revenue there as well. So what would it take for us to address our $10 million structural deficit from the revenue side? Well, this just gives you an idea of what go back one slide, what $1 million of new revenue, what that would be based on. If we had 146 more undergraduate students paying the average net price, so that's what they're billed less the average amount of discounting, 146 new undergraduate students would give us $1 million. On the other hand, and I think this is probably where we need to focus more, is if we retained 146 more undergraduate students, that would also give us $1 million. Obviously, you can also increase the price, assuming that the students can pay, which is becoming a very challenging balancing act for us. So if you increase the price, the net tuition revenue per undergraduate student by $118, that would also give you $1 million. And on the graduate student side, you can say the same thing. 80 new graduate students, or a $440 increase in net tuition revenue per graduate student. And then also on the state funding side, $1 million would be 2.4% of our state funding. We're focusing here. We want to grow our revenue. We've talked about the work that's being done that we're actually getting ready to kick off this week, I think, with Huron on strategic enrollment management. First, focusing primarily on that undergraduate side because it's the most significant part of our budget, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to recruit undergraduate students, price appropriately, discount tuition appropriately, and retain those students. So the work with Huron is very important in making sure that we take advantage of the revenue opportunities that we do have. On the other hand, we are going to have to face some difficult cost-cutting choices. This shows our overall budget. Salaries and benefits make up the largest portion of it, 70% of our budget. You also see the operating expenses that we referred to, as well as debt service. Debt service basically just means our bond payments, and then our capital expenses. This is at $8.4 million. I think for next year, we're going to need to contain that a little bit, sort of dampen down the amount that we spend on capital again as a temporary measure. So how would we save $1 million? Not suggesting that this is the way that we're going to do it, but it just gives you a way to quantify what makes up $1 million. 12% of administrator salaries, 2% of all other staff salaries, 2% of faculty salaries. And then you can also see, 14% of supplies. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that cutting our supplies by 14% makes sense. It's just to sort of quantify for you what it would take to save $1 million. So here's where we are. What's next? In the spring, probably in mid to late January, we'll have some more campus-wide discussions that will share what exactly are our plans, what are we thinking about for the fiscal year 20 budget development. Everybody's well aware that over the course of the spring is when we were actually building the budget for fiscal year 20, making decisions. So some important conversations early in January so then we can kick off the budget process. I've already mentioned we're going to continue to work on revenue growth. Right now, most urgently, the work with Huron is on the undergraduate side, but I think also on the graduate side, and I see Nancy Rubin here, and I know on the extended campus side, making sure that we are taking advantage of every opportunity that we have to continue to serve our students and generate revenue from new sources. We'll also need to decide which university-wide cost-saving options we'll do. I think everyone knows the list of 13 potential cost-saving options. So we'll need to decide which of those we're going to do. But we won't do all of them. And they in and of themselves won't fully do what we need to do on the expense side. So that's where we get to having a decentralized approach where we're going to empower the folks who have been saying, look, we care about this university. We know where we can make cuts. If you'll just tell us how much to cut, we'll do the right thing. We'll figure out where we can reduce so that we can continue to serve students, but just tell us how much we need to cut. So those will be things that will also be coming out in the spring. We won't solve this problem all in fiscal year 20. It'll take a little bit more time, so we'll have to once again sort of use our reserves or spend down our cash balances in fiscal year 20. But then by fiscal year 21, we really do need to fully address this structural deficit, stop talking about reductions, because then we need to start talking about what are the things that we're going to grow and invest in and help us move forward. So we've got 2 years here where we've got some important work to do. It's not going to be easy, but it's setting us up for building our stronger UNC, really addressing those retention and graduation rates that Andy's been talking about and are so important to both us and to our students.